So James is going to talk about defeating Jihad.
Yeah, the winnable. What is it? Subtitle: The Winnable War on the Inside. So it's written by dude. Is kind of like a Hungarian refugee from way back when 1956 or something like that. So, or no, his dad was a refugee, and because he's too young for that. Because that would make him considerably older than me, and I think he's considerably younger. Anyway, he comes from Hungarian extraction, I think, on both sides of his family. And so he's fighting, talking about defeating Jihad. This was published in 2016. The blurbs on the back and in the front are perhaps significant. Steve Bannon, executive chairman of Breitbart News. Trent Franks, Republican, Arizona, member of the House Armed Services Committee, so he's a Republican, and I presume a true believer.
And this came in from Warner
Memorial Library. Okay,
yeah,
so Ralph Peters, Fox News strategic analyst and author of Valley of the Shadow. That must be the Valley of the Shadow of Death. That's taken from the Bible. Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, U.S. Army retired, former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. I don't have to tell you how he and Steve Bannon, the blurb on the back, were connected with the Trump administration. Here's Trent Franks again. John Batchelor, author and host of the John Batchelor Show. Have you ever heard of that? It's probably one of those Fox Network kind. Or here's Steve Bannon again. Anyway, that's where this is coming from, the right-hand side of the political spectrum. And I'm not terribly impressed with the right-hand side of the political spectrum, but I'm not terribly impressed with the left-hand, well, the fake left-hand side of the political spectrum either these days. These guys don't really read books. Every so occasionally you get one bozo like this guy who writes a book or something like that. And of course, left-wingers, some of them read literature and stuff like that poorly. I can tell from the crappy fake poetry that they tend to write and stuff like that. But and they're very bad at so they're not very good at reading fiction. In other words, they don't read much of it, and when they do, it's or nonfiction, I should say. They're going around saying, well, this is just fiction anyway. They talk about narratives and discourses and stuff like that, and as a result, their analysis of stuff is really, really stupid. They're very bad at putting stuff together and things like that. So, of course, they've got their own little narrative, which is as true can be. It's as true as gospel truth. But anything else that doesn't conform to their little narrative it's like fake news and stuff like that.
Okay, but you did enjoy reading this book. Yes, you would recommend it?
Well, I here's what I recommend. Don't read this sort of stuff. Read he says it's a primer. And, and it is a primer because there's like, I don't know how many pages of appendices. It's like 100 pages of appendices or something like that. Let me see. Yeah, so... It might be more. There's 80 pages of appendices, so that's a lot, right?
Mm-hmm.
Out of a 234-page book, that's a third of the book is appendices.
Yeah, but you want the meat. That's the meat.
Well, see, what these are things about the Cold War. Documents about the Cold War. He didn't actually write the appendices. So one is George Kennan's long telegram, I think it's in 1946 or something like that. Like there were people in Washington, he was an expert apparently on Russia, and they're saying, what's happening? And he said, get ready. Like you've been in the Cold War basically for 30 years, almost 30 years. And I think he actually uses the term Cold War, right? The other one's from 1950, and it was written, it's NSC, that's National Security Council 68. And it was put together by a variety of different people, and it's outlining, both Kennan and this NSC 68 outline how to fight a Cold War. I mean, in the NSC 68 it says we've got several different options. We can just go the course, and this was right after they lost, or the world lost China to crazy communism, Maoism. And then what else was it? Then it was isolationism, which was what Republicans generally were all about back then. And then what was the other was just war, and it was understood that it would probably have to be nuclear war. And then the fourth thing, they say it's the only option, which is just patient negotiation and letting the crazy system wind itself down. I mean, that's what the Americans did, and it took them a long time from there, 1950 to roughly 1990, 40 years. Very patient. They didn't get the world embroiled in bad wars, like a world-ending war. The communists, of course, fought very brutally, using war crimes, multiple war crimes. And the Americans, by times, responded almost as brutally, for example, in Vietnam. But, of course, when you're fighting war crimes, my understanding of things like the Hague Conventions and stuff like that is you're entitled. In fact, as far as I'm concerned, it's your duty when you're dealing with a system as grungy and as sleazy and as slimy with blood and guts as communism. It's your duty to actually defeat it, and you try to do it humanely, but doesn't work out.
Well, I mean, when they always say it takes two to start a fight, and it does not.
That's true.
And they say,
tell that to the Jews who, they're not around. The Jews who didn't survive the Holocaust.
Sure.
They didn't pick that fight. It was picked for them, and they really didn't, weren't able to respond in kind. A few people did it in the Warsaw Ghetto, and they just got wiped out.
but when people will also talk about responding in kind, right?
Mm-hmm.
If somebody opens a door, if then that's you just gotta. If one person opens the door, then the other one has to expect the other person is going to be able to go through that door too. It's just, it goes both ways, right? So, yeah.
And that's what the communists were doing in Vietnam. It wasn't a local insurgency, or as it was portrayed. It was the communists. Basically, they were peasants. Peasants don't have revolutions. Marx would laugh at the idea that the Vietnamese were having a revolution, that these bunch of peasants, they don't have a revolution. It was a revolution brought in elsewhere from China and from Russia. It wasn't a revolution, it was a devolution. That's the way what communists handled it. Anyway, so I would recommend getting hold of this book so you can read actually what the Americans were saying. They were saying, we're going to be patient, we're not going to have nuclear war. And what they were saying is, the communists understand that we're not going to attack them with nuclear weapons, and we're going to have to deal with that. And they were saying what they'll be doing is doing exactly what they were doing in Vietnam and Korea and stuff like that. They'll have these local things pretending that it's local, but it's really them invading, just small, trying to get things piecemeal and stuff like that. So it's very, very, it's actually done.
So you're saying read the appendices?
Yeah, read the appendices. This sort of thing's a primer. It's 150 pages. How are you going to talk about jihad, much less defeating it? So what he's saying is use the Cold War sort of thing. Well, that's interesting, because you see, he points out that the worst victims of jihadi terrorism are Muslims themselves, and he's not making it up.
No, you were talking about it with hockey. The players who are really tough, like you were talking about the Boston Bruins and stuff like that.
Oh yeah, they end up suffering themselves, right?
Yeah.
So,
because they're fighting like that every game.
Every game.
Whereas
and
the people who they're playing against, well, they only have to fight like that when they're
playing against the brutes.
Yeah,
exactly. So that's actually quite perceptive. I mean, that's what happened with the communists. The communists were hard-assing things everywhere. They huge amounts of their gross domestic product went to the military. It was just military, military, military. They kept on saying, "We're for peace and we're for developing our economy," and then they pour all the stuff, and the Americans are just laughing. Keep on pouring, morons. We'll actually have a more contented populace, and we'll keep on developing our other resources, and actually developing the sciences and things like that.
Yeah, but every time the Republicans got elected in, it seemed like there were certain. I mean, it became really clear in the Bush Jr. Cheney.
Yeah, the Cheney presidency,
the Cheney,
junior
yes.
cheerleadership.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But there were so many people that were businesses that were siphoning money out in a it was like a fake sort of we need this money for war sort of thing, but really it was businesses that were
Halliburton, Cheney was incredible. I mean, it's an indication, of how serious a country is about a war when you see what the rich people are doing for the war effort. So George Bush Sr., who was the president, he actually served in World War II.
He
was a fighter pilot. And so his dad was
that's
rich.
Why Junior came in on the.
Yeah, he's trying to keep up with his dad, right?
Yeah.
And his dad was the best American Republican president in my lifetime. That's not to say he was good at all. I mean, he was surpassed by almost every Democratic president, except for Jimmy Carter, who was an absolute moron, and he still is. And I'm not sure about Obama. I mean, he had a good first term, second term. Obama didn't understand foreign policy. I gotta say, George Bush Sr. did. At any rate, that's why he didn't take down Saddam Hussein. He realized that Iraq would be a schmaltz without some idiot holding it together. So at any rate, here's the primer. He says this is the primer for defeating jihad. Defeating jihad is not the key. The key is to understand jihad. The greater and the lesser jihad, the greater stuff is supposed to be the internal jihad and things like that. So here's what I recommend. And it's not a recommendation. Here's the deal. It's required reading. If you want to yap about jihad, if you want to talk about Islam, if you want to talk about Muslims, if you want to talk about anything like that, if you want to talk about the Middle East, it's required, at least with me, it's required reading. It's not this. This guy doesn't understand jihad, much less how to defeat it. Okay? He says it's going to be like the Cold War. No, the Cold War was a different thing. The people actually hated communism. The people who are under communism. The people who are under Islam love it. The vast majority identify with it on the most fundamental level. 80% in places on average in the Middle East. It's the same thing in Pakistan. In Nigeria, it's about 50%. In Indonesia, it's about 30%. This guy does not understand that. The level of identification with Islam, the most fundamental interpretations of Islam Sharia law, is like 80% in the Middle East, and 80% in Pakistan, 50% in Nigeria, 30% in Indonesia. High levels of identification. You're not going to defeat. He's talking about fundamentalist Islam. Fundamentalist Islam is supported hugely by Muslims around the world. You're not going to defeat it by letting the system fall apart. When the system falls apart, they still identify with it. The system, the political and economic system, fell apart starting 1700 in Europe. 1683, the Ottoman Empire reached its maximum extent. They laid siege for the second time to Vienna. That's in Austria, capital of Austria. It's not Eastern Europe, it's Middle Europe, basically, from what I can tell. It's German people there. It's Catholic. It's not Eastern Orthodox. It's not Greeks. It's not Slavs or stuff like that. So here's required reading. Why wouldn't it be? The Quran. And it's not a big, long read. It might be a difficult read for some people, stuff like that, but it's about as long as the New Testament. The New Testament you can read in one day. You can read the Quran if you can put up with the. It's like a bunch of sermons put together. I personally don't like sermons. Some people love them. If you love sermons, you might be, especially bunched together, you might be able to go through it in one day. It takes me a long time to go through the Quran. I've gone through it 3 times. It's not as I'm being a hypocrite and telling you to do what I haven't done. And I'm working on it through the Arabic, and I'm working through it in different translations, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th time, right? So, all the translations are awful, but, you make your own judgment about the translations. You make your own judgment. It's really required to read at least more than one translation. And read it in translation. Try to read it in the original Arabic, like I'm trying. And it's really required. If you want to be a smart left-winger, you got to learn other languages. Learn Arabic. Learn a huge whack. I'm taking my 23rd language at university, and it's not as though I'm sloughing through. I get good marks.